Recorded Books and One Click Digital present Quartet for the End of Time by Johanna Skibsrud. Narrated by Tandy, Cronyn.
Chapter 1. Sutton. Riot on the Mall. The Judge's House, District of Columbia Courthouse, Camp Marks, Washington, D.C., June through July 1932, with a brief detour to the District of Columbia Courthouse, 1928. It was her mother who accompanied Sutton to her father's door, who stood beside her, hand raised and trembling, before she finally brought it down, knocking sharply twice, who in response to her husband's voice, which echoed from inside, touched her daughter lightly on the shoulder, as though in sympathy for something that she couldn't name, then stepped aside to let her pass. It was the afternoon following the riots. Alden had not yet returned, and the household had been thrown into turmoil of a rare sort. Her mother's incursion beyond the limit of her own quarters was certain evidence of this. And now, inexplicably, the judge wished to speak to her. She was to listen very carefully, her mother warned, and do as she was told. This was counsel that could in itself have hardly been deemed unusual, except that it went without saying in the Kelly house. When the judge spoke, there was never any choice but to listen. Of all people, it was her mother who should have known that. Sutton had, therefore, no idea what sort of man to expect in her father's room, now that the remarkable idea had been introduced, if in the negative, that her father was a man whom she conceivably might not listen to or obey. What drew her attention immediately, however, upon first entering, was not anything out of the ordinary with her father himself. He appeared very much as he always had, sitting upright behind his desk in his straight-backed chair, but a hat. A man's hat. Rather sad and misshapen-looking, it sat incongruously on her father's desk. A hat on the table, as the judge himself had taught her, was a very definite sign of bad luck. It was an old cowboy code, a tradition the judge prided himself in having inherited, though truth be told, the Kellys themselves had never been actual cowboys. They were wheat farmers from Indiana. The judge kept an old riding whip anyway as proof of his Midwestern pedigree. It lay coiled in his desk's thin middle drawer, and from time to time he would take it out and flick it back and forth with a repetitive twist of his wrist, making as he did so a swishing sound that could be heard through the house. They always knew when the judge was in a meditative mood because of it. It never failed, he said, that particular rhythm, and the accompanying sound the whip made as it cut through the air, to soothe him and help him to think. Perhaps, as he reflected on more than one occasion, it was due to being reminded through the object's weight and the steady rhythm of it in his hand of its great and complicated history, which by extension was also his own. As a child, Sutton had marveled over the multitude of various conflicting details that surrounded the object, and it had taken her many years to realize what it meant that, on the subject of the whip, her father never told the same story twice. Now, however, though the judge had taken the whip from its drawer, he merely fingered its rough leather absently. Only occasionally did he allow it to twitch restlessly, as if more or less of its own accord in his hand. In any case, it was not her father's whip, but the hat which held Sutton's attention as she entered her father's room. Why on earth, she wondered, had he not only let it remain on the table, but seemed to have deliberately placed it there? It seemed quite pointless, she reflected, and she could only assume that on this count the judge himself would agree. It was only according to his code, after all, that she considered the matter, to go about knowingly courting ill fortune in this way or any other way, even if one was, as the judge himself, despite any romantic illusions, surely was, the very opposite of a superstitious man. Things don't just happen, he had told her and Alden, on she didn't know how many countless occasions. You make them happen. Behind his desk, Judge Kelly was sitting very upright indeed. It was the same posture he assumed while marching in the parade every 4th of July.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?